Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, Chapter 10. Marian's preserver, as Margaret, with more elegance and precision styled Willoughby, called at the cottage early next morning to make his personal inquiries. He was received by Mrs. Dashwood with more politeness, with a kindness in which Sir John's account of him and her own gratitude prompted, and everything that passed during the visit tended to assure him of the sense, elegance, mutual affection, and domestic comfort of the family to whom accident had now introduced of him. Of their personal terms, he had not required a second interview to be convinced. Miss Dashwood, with a delicate complexion, regular features, and a remarkable pretty figure. Marianne was still handsomer, her former, though not as correct as her sister's, and having the advantage of height, was more striking, with her face so lovely. When in common cant of praise she was called a beautiful girl, truth was less violently outraged than usually happens. Her skin was very brown, but, from the transparency, her complexion was commonly brilliant. Her features were all good, her smile was sweet and attractive, and in her eyes, which were very dark, was a life, a spirit and eagerness, which could hardly be seen without delight. From Willoughby their expressions were at first held back, but by the embarrassment of which remembrance of assistance created. But when he passed away, with her spirits became collected, when she saw that to the next perfect good breeding of the gentleman he reunited frankness and vivacity, of which above all she had heard him declare that of music and dancing was passionately fond. She gave him such a look of approbation and secured that the largest share of his discourse of herself for the rest of his stay. It was only necessary to mention any favorite amusement of the engagement to her talk. She could not be silent when such points were introduced, and she had neither shyness or reserve in their discussion. They speedily discovered that the enjoyment of dancing and music was mutual, and that it arose from the general conformity of judgment, and that all that related to either. Encouraged by this to further examination of his opinions, she proceeded to question him on the subject of books. Her favorite authors were brought forward and dwelt upon, and the rapturous of the delight that any man of 25 must have been insensible to, indeed not become immediately converted to the excellence of such works, however disregarded before. Their taste was strikingly alike, the same books, the same passages were idolized by each, and of every indifference appeared. Any objection arose, it lasted longer than till force of the arguments that the brightness of her eyes could be displayed. He acquiesced in all of that decisions, caught in her enthusiasm, and long before he could conclude that they conversed with such a familiarity of a long establishment acquaintance. "Well, Marianne," said Elinor, as soon as he left, "for one morning I think you have done pretty well. You have already ascertained that Mr. Willoughby's opinions in almost every matter to be important. You know what he thinks of Cowper and Scott, and you are certainly estimating of their beauties, and he ought to have received every assurance of his admiring of the Pope, no more than is proper, but how your acquaintance to be long supported under such extraordinary dispatch of every subject for the discourse. You will soon have exhausted each of his favorite topic. Another meeting will suffice, and explain the sentiments on the picturesque beauty of second marriages, and then you can have nothing further to ask." "Elinor," cried Marianne, "is that fair? Is it just? Are my ideas so scanty? But I see what you mean. I have been too at my ease, too happy, too frank. I have erred against every commonplace notion of decorum. I have been open and sincere where I ought to have been reserved, spiritless, dull, and deceitful. Had I talked only of the weather and the roads, I had spoken only once in 10 minutes. This reproach would have been separated." "My love," said her mother, "you must not be offended with Elinor. She was only in jest. I should scold her myself if I were capable of wishing to check on the delight of your conversations with our new friend." Marianne was softened by this moment. Willoughby, on his side, gave every proof of pleasure in their acquaintance. He came to them every day to inquire after Marianne, was at first of the excuse, but the encouragement of reception, to which every day gave greater kindness, made such an excuse unnecessary before it had ceased to be possible by Marianne's perfect recovery. She was confined for some days of the house, but never of any confinement been less irksome. Willoughby was a young man of good abilities, quick imagination, lively spirits, and often affectionate manners. He was exactly former to engage Marianne's heart, for with all of this he joined not only a captivating person, but natural ardor of mind, which is now roused and increased by the example of her own. and which recommended him to her affection by everything else. Her society became gradually most exquisite of enjoyment. They read, they talked, and they sang to each other, which his musical talents were considerable, and he read with all of the sensibility and spirit of which Edward had unfortunately wanted. In Mrs. Dashwood's estimation, he was faultless as in Marianne's, and Elinor saw nothing to censure him of his propensity, in which he strongly resembled a particularly delightful of his sister, of saying too much what he thought of every occasion without attention to persons or circumstances, and hastily forming and giving his opinions on other people, and sacrificing general politeness to the enjoyment of the undivided attention, where his heart was engaged in a slightly too easy form of worldly propriety. He displayed a want of caution with Elinor that she could not approve, in spite of all that he and Marianne could say in its support. Marianne began now to perceive that the desperation of which seized her at 16 and a half, of ever seeing a man who could satisfy her ideas of perfection, had rash and unjustifiable. Willoughby was all of that her fancy and delineated in her unhappy hour, of which every brighter period as accepting of her attachment of her, and in his behavior declared his wishes to be in that respect as earnest as his abilities were strong. Her mother, too, in which those mind who could not speculate through their marriage had been raised, his prospect of riches, was led before the end of a week to hope and expect it, and secretly to congratulate herself on having gained two such son-in-laws as Edward and Willoughby. Colonel Brandon's partiality for Marianne, which had so clearly been discovered by his friends, now first became perceptible to Elinor, when it ceased to be noticed by them. Their attention and wit were drawn off to his more fortunate rival, and the raillery of which, the other hand, had occurred before any partiality rose. It was removed when his feelings began, and call for the ridicule so just annexed to sensibility. Elinor was obliged, though unwillingly, to believe that the sentiments of Mrs. Jennings had assigned him for her own satisfaction were now actually excited by her sister, and that however general resemblance of disposition between the parties might forward the affection of Mr. Willoughby, an equally striking opposition of character has no hindrance on the regard of Colonel Brandon. She saw it with concern, for what had a silent man of 35 hope, when opposed by a very lively of 120 and 5, and she could not even wish him successful. She heartily wished him indifferent. She liked him, in spite of his gravity and reserve. She beheld in him the object of interest. His manners, though serious, were mild, and his reserve appeared rather the result of some oppression of spirits than any natural gloominess of temper. Sir John had dropped hints of the past injuries and disappointments, of which justified her belief in his being an unfortunate man, and she regarded him with the respect of compassion. Perhaps she pitied the esteem of which he had more because of he was slighted by Willoughby, and Marianne, who was prejudiced against him, had been neither lively nor young, seemed resolved and undervalued of his merits. "Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day when they were talking with him together, "whom everybody speaks well of and nobody cares about, whom all are delighted to see and nobody remembers to talk to." "That is exactly what I think of him," cried Marianne. "Do not boast of it, however," said Elinor, "for it is injustice in both of you. He is highly esteemed by all of the family at the Park, and I never ever see himself without taking pains of conversing with him. That he patronized by you," said Willoughby, "is certainly in his favor. But as for the esteem of others, it is reproachable with himself. Who would submit to the indignity of being approved by such women as Lady Middleton and Mrs. Jennings, that could command the indifference of anybody else? But perhaps the abuse of such people as yourself and Marianne will make amends of the rest of the guard for Lady Middleton and her mother. If their praise is censure, your censure may be praise, for they are not more undiscerning of their prejudice than you are unjust. In defense of your protege, you can even be saucy. My protege, as you call him, is a sensible man, and sense will always have attractions for me. Yes, Marianne, even in the man between 30 and 40, has such a great deal of a world. He has been abroad, he has read and thinking mind, and I have found found him capable of giving me such information in various subjects that he has always answered my inquiries with readiness and good breeding of good nature. That is to say, cried Marianne contemptuously, he has told you that into the East Indies and the climate is hot, and the mosquitoes are troublesome. He would have told me so, I doubt not, had I had made such inquiries, but they happen to be points on which I have not previously been informed. Perhaps, said Willoughby, his observations may have extended to the existence of nabobs, goldmoors, and palanquins. I may venture to say that his observations have stretched much further than your candor, but why should you dislike him? I do not dislike him. I consider him of the contrary as a very respectable man, and everybody has good word and nobody's noticed. Who has more money and can spend more time than he knows how to employ in 2 new coats every year? Add to which, cried Marianne, that there has never been a genius nor taste of spirit, that his understanding no brilliancy, his feelings no ardor, and his voice no expression. You decide on his imperfections so much in mass, replied Eleanor, and so much on the strength of your own imagination, that the commandment of the ability to give him the comparatively cold and insipid, I can only pronounce him to be a sensible man, well-bred, well-informed, of any gentleness and address, I believe, possessing an amiable heart. Miss Dashwood, cried Mr. Willoughby, you are now using me unkindly. You are endeavoring as to disarm me by reason and convincing me against my will, but I will not do it. You shall find me as stubborn as you can be artful, and 3 unanswered reasons for disliking Colonel Brandon. He has threatened me with rain when I wanted it to be fine. He has found me with fault in hanging my curricle, and I cannot persuade him to buy my brown mare. If it be any satisfaction to you, however, to be that told, I believe his character to be other respects irreproachable. I am ready to confess it, and I return for your acknowledgment, which must give me some pain. You cannot deny me the privilege of disliking him as much as ever.